6 months ago, I never imagined I'd be sitting in my son's kitchen at 7 in the morning, waiting for someone else to bring me my tea. The irony isn't lost on me. I spent 43 years as a librarian, helping others find what they needed, and now I can barely find my way to the bathroom without my glasses. The fall that changed everything happened on a Tuesday. I remember because I was rushing to finish my grocery shopping before the senior discount ended. One moment I was reaching for a can of soup on the top shelf, the next I was sprawled on the cold linoleum floor of aisle 7, my hip screaming in protest. The young paramedic who helped me had kind eyes, but I could see the pity there too. "Don't worry, ma'am," he said, "these things happen. These things happen." As if my independence was just another item that could slip from my grasp and shatter. David drove 3 hours from the city the moment he got the call from the hospital. My son, my successful, caring engineer son, took one look at my x-rays and the walker the physical therapist insisted I'd need for months, and made the decision for me. "Mom, you're coming home with us. Jessica and I have plenty of room, and you shouldn't be alone while you recover." At the time, I was grateful. The alternative was a rehabilitation facility that smelled of disinfectant and defeat, where I'd watched my friend Helen disappear into herself before she passed last year. Jessica had been so sweet about it too, rearranging their spare bedroom to accommodate my things, buying a shower chair, even installing grab bars in their guest bathroom. "We're family," she'd said, squeezing my hand with her perfectly manicured fingers. "This is what family does." Those first weeks felt like a gift, despite the pain. David would help me down the stairs each morning, and Jessica would have my tea ready, Earl Grey with 1 sugar, just how I liked it. She'd set up my books on the kitchen table where the light was best, rotating between the large print mysteries I'd requested and the historical fiction that had always been my escape. I felt useful when she asked my opinion on color schemes for her real estate listings, or when David sought my advice about a difficult client. We were a family again, the way we'd been when David was young and would call me every Sunday without fail. I tried to contribute however I could. Despite the walker and my increasingly blurry vision, the macular degeneration had been worsening for 2 years. I insisted on folding laundry and setting the table for dinner. Jessica would laugh and call me stubborn, but in a fond way that reminded me of how I used to tease David when he'd refuse help with his homework. I'd prepare simple lunches while they were at work, leaving covered plates in the refrigerator with little notes: "David, your favorite tuna salad, extra pickles," or "Jessica, that chicken salad you mentioned liking." Evenings were the best part. David would come home, his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up, looking so much like his father had at that age that my heart would catch. We'd sit in the living room, him in his father's old recliner, me on the couch with my feet up as the doctor ordered, and talk about everything and nothing. He'd tell me about his projects, the bridge renovation that was giving him headaches, or the new junior engineer who reminded him of himself 20 years ago. I'd share stories from my library days, the regulars who'd become like family, the rare books that had passed through my hands like secrets waiting to be discovered. Jessica would usually join us after finishing her client calls, curling up next to David with a glass of wine and adding her own stories from the real estate world. She had a talent for voices, imitating difficult clients in ways that made us all laugh until my sides hurt. Those moments felt precious, 3 generations under one roof, sharing the day's small victories and defeats. I should have known it was too good to last. Nothing that perfect ever does, especially when it's built on someone else's sacrifice. But at the time, adjusting my reading glasses and sipping my perfectly prepared tea while listening to my son's laughter, I allowed myself to believe that maybe losing my independence had led me to something better. Maybe this was how families were supposed to work, taking care of each other when the world became too sharp and unpredictable. I was wrong, of course. But in those early days, wrapped in the warmth of what I thought was unconditional love, I couldn't see the storm gathering behind Jessica's careful smiles and David's well-meaning but absent attention. I was just a mother, grateful to be home. Looking back now, I can see the warning signs were there from the very beginning, scattered like breadcrumbs along a path I was too trusting to recognize as leading into a dark forest. When I first moved in with David and Sarah 8 months ago, I was grieving Harold's death and desperate for the comfort of family. Sarah's initial helpfulness felt like a warm embrace during the coldest period of my life. "Margaret, dear," she'd said during my second week there, her voice carrying that same honeyed tone she'd later perfect for her public performances, "I've been thinking about your daily routine. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could structure your days a bit more? You know, to help you feel more settled." At the time, her suggestion that I take my morning coffee at exactly 8 o'clock seemed considerate, a way to bring order to my grief-scattered days. But suggestions became expectations, and expectations hardened into demands so gradually that I barely noticed the transformation. My flexible morning became a rigid schedule. My afternoon naps were now mandatory rest periods that conveniently coincided with Sarah's phone calls with friends, calls where I later realized she was building her reputation as my devoted caregiver. "Oh, I just put Margaret down for her nap," I'd overhear her saying. "The poor dear gets so confused when she's tired." The first real crack in Sarah's perfect facade appeared on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring. I was arranging some of Harold's books on the shelf in what had become my bedroom when I accidentally knocked over Sarah's crystal vase, a wedding gift she'd mentioned cost $800. The sound of shattering glass seemed to echo through the house like a gunshot, and before I could even bend down to clean up the pieces, Sarah appeared in the doorway. What I saw in her face in that split second before she composed herself still haunts me. It wasn't disappointment or even anger, it was pure, cold rage, the kind of expression that belongs on someone's face right before they do something terrible. Her eyes went completely flat, like a shark's, and for a moment I felt like prey caught in the open with nowhere to hide. "You stupid old woman," she hissed, her voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than if she'd screamed. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Before I could apologize, before I could even fully process what was happening, her hands were on my shoulders, her manicured nails digging through my thin cardigan as she shook me with surprising strength. The pain was immediate and shocking. My arthritis made my shoulders particularly sensitive, and Sarah's grip sent lightning bolts of agony down my arms. But worse than the physical pain was the look in her eyes, completely devoid of the warmth and care she showed everyone else. This wasn't the Sarah who brought me tea and asked about my day. This was someone else entirely, someone who looked at me like I was an inconvenience she was barely tolerating. $800, she repeated, her grip tightening with each word. $800. And you just, she shook me again, harder this time, hard enough that my teeth clicked together. "You just knock it over like it's nothing, like you're not already enough of a burden on this family." I tried to speak, to apologize, to explain that it was an accident, but no words came. I was 72 years old, and I hadn't been physically intimidated by another person since I was a child. The shock of it rendered me completely speechless. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Sarah released me so abruptly that I stumbled backward, my shoulder hitting the door frame. Her face transformed in an instant, concern replacing rage like a mask sliding into place. "Oh my goodness, Margaret. Are you hurt?" "I'm so sorry, I was just so startled by the noise, and I moved too quickly to steady you." The gaslighting began immediately. "You know how my reflexes are since the car accident last year," she continued, referring to a minor fender bender that had left her jumpy around sudden sounds. "I just reached out instinctively when I saw you starting to fall. Thank goodness I caught you before you could hurt yourself on those glass pieces. But I knew what I had experienced. The fingerprint bruises on my shoulders that would bloom purple by evening weren't from someone trying to steady me, they were from someone who had lost control and wanted to hurt me. Someone who saw me not as David's beloved mother, but as an obstacle to her perfect life. "It's fine, dear," I heard myself saying, already falling into the pattern that would define the next several months. "Thank you for catching me." Even as the words left my mouth, I could feel something fundamental shifting inside me, some basic trust in my own safety beginning to erode. Sarah's smile was radiant with relief, but her eyes remained watchful. "Let me help you clean this up," she said, already reaching for the dustpan. "We'll just tell David it was an accident," which it was, of course. These things happen when we get older. As I watched her carefully sweep up the crystal fragments, each piece catching the afternoon light like tears, I had the strangest thought. I was looking at my future scattered across the hardwood floor, and Sarah was the one holding the dustpan, deciding which pieces were worth saving. The crystal vase incident marked the beginning of what I now recognize as Sarah's systematic campaign to cut me off from the outside world. It didn't happen overnight. That would have been too obvious, too easy for David or others to notice. Instead, Sarah operated like a master gardener, carefully pruning away each connection in my life until I was left standing alone in an increasingly small circle of her making. It started with my weekly bridge club at the community center, a tradition I'd maintained for nearly 15 years. Every Thursday at 2 o'clock, I would meet with Eleanor, Ruth, and Betty to play cards, share gossip, and maintain the friendships that had sustained me through Harold's illness and death. These women knew me, really knew me. They could read my moods, catch my jokes, and call me out when I was being stubborn. In retrospect, they were exactly the kind of witnesses Sarah couldn't afford to have in my life. "Margaret, sweetheart," Sarah said one Thursday morning, her voice dripping with false concern as she watched me gather my purse and cardigan, "I've been thinking about your bridge games. Don't you think all that concentration might be a bit much for you these days? I've noticed you seem so exhausted afterward." I paused at the front door, confused. Exhausted? "Sarah, I love bridge. It keeps my mind sharp." "Of course you do, dear," she replied, moving closer with that predatory grace I was beginning to recognize. "But I've been reading about cognitive decline in seniors, and overstimulation can actually accelerate memory problems. I'm just worried about you." Her hand found my shoulder, the same shoulder she'd gripped during the vase incident, and squeezed gently. Not hard enough to hurt, but with just enough pressure to remind me of what she was capable of. "I don't have memory problems," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I could hear the uncertainty creeping into my voice. Sarah had been commenting lately on my forgetfulness, asking if I'd remembered to take my medications when I always had, wondering aloud if I'd turned off the stove when I never left it on. Small seeds of doubt that were beginning to sprout. "Of course not," Sarah said quickly, her smile never wavering. "I'm just being cautious. Preventative care, you know. Maybe we could skip this week, just to see how you feel." That single missed Thursday became 2, then a month. Eleanor called twice asking if I was feeling well. Sarah answered both times, explaining with perfect sincerity that I was having some good days and bad days, and that she was trying to keep Margaret's stress levels manageable. By the time I was allowed to speak to Eleanor, Sarah had already painted a picture of an increasingly frail woman who needed careful monitoring. "Oh, Margaret," Eleanor said when I finally got to the phone, her voice heavy with sympathy. "Sarah explained about your confusion spells. We miss you terribly, but of course your health comes first. We'll be here whenever you're feeling up to it." Confusion spells. I'd never had a confusion spell in my life, but somehow Sarah had convinced my oldest friend that I was declining mentally. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Sarah wasn't just controlling my present, she was rewriting my reality for everyone who mattered to me. The phone calls were next. My daily conversations with my sister Helen in Phoenix became monitored interactions. Sarah would hover nearby during my calls, making concerned faces and helpful gestures that reminded me I was supposed to be unwell. "Don't let me tire you out too much, Helen," she'd call out loud enough for my sister to hear. "Margaret's been having such a difficult week." Soon, Helen began cutting our conversations short herself. "You sound tired, Maggie," she'd say, using the childhood nickname only family used. "Maybe you should rest. I'll call again in a few days." But Sarah would intercept those calls too, explaining that I was napping, or having a difficult day, or at a doctor's appointment. My world began shrinking like a wool sweater in hot water, each wash cycle making it smaller and tighter until I could barely move. The grocery shopping I'd insisted on doing myself became too risky for someone with my balance issues. My subscription to the local newspaper was cancelled because Sarah worried the upsetting news might agitate me. Even my simple pleasure of walking to the mailbox each morning was deemed too dangerous after Sarah mentioned to David that she'd seen me stumble on the front steps. "Mom, maybe Sarah's right," David said one evening when I protested about the mailbox restriction. "The last thing we want is for you to fall and break a hip. Sarah's just looking out for you. Looking out for me." The phrase had become Sarah's shield, deflecting any criticism or question about the increasingly narrow boundaries of my existence. Who could argue with someone who was just looking out for their elderly mother-in-law? By late spring, my daily human contact had been reduced to David when he came home from work, usually tired and distracted, and Sarah, who had positioned herself as my sole caregiver and interpreter to the outside world. I was living in a house with other people but felt more alone than I had even in the darkest days after Harold's death. The most insidious part was how gradually it happened, how reasonable each individual restriction seemed in isolation. It wasn't until I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd had a conversation with someone other than David or Sarah that I understood what she'd accomplished. I had become a prisoner in a cell built from concern, guarded by someone the world saw as my devoted protector. And the worst part? I was starting to believe her version of events myself. David's 45th birthday party was Sarah's masterpiece of deception, a perfectly orchestrated performance that would haunt me for months afterward. As I sit here now, I can still feel the phantom weight of her hands on my shoulders during our preparation session that morning, still hear the careful coaching that transformed me from a woman into a prop in her elaborate theater. "Now Margaret," she'd said, standing behind me as I sat at my vanity mirror, her reflection looming over mine like a specter, "tonight is very important for David. All his colleagues will be there, people from the firm, some potential new partners. We want them to see what a loving, stable family he has." Her fingers worked through my silver hair with the practiced efficiency of a mortician preparing a body for viewing. I watched her face in the mirror as she spoke, noting how her expression remained perfectly pleasant even as her grip on my hair grew unnecessarily tight. "You'll wear the blue dress with the pearl necklace, the one that makes you look so dignified. And when people ask how you're doing, you'll tell them how grateful you are to have such a caring family, how blessed you feel to be so well looked after." "What if someone asks about my friends?" I ventured, thinking of Eleanor and the bridge club I hadn't seen in months. "What if they wonder why I don't go out anymore?" Sarah's hands stilled in my hair, and our eyes met in the mirror. For just a moment, I saw that familiar flash of cold fury before her mask snapped back into place. "You'll explain that you prefer quiet evenings at home now, that you're so much happier since moving in with us. You'll tell them how I make sure you have everything you need, how devoted I am to your care." Her voice dropped to that whisper that had become my personal soundtrack of terror. "You wouldn't want to embarrass David by seeming ungrateful, would you, Margaret? Especially not in front of his colleagues." The threat was clear, even wrapped in concern. I nodded obediently, already feeling my spirit deflating like a punctured balloon. By the time Sarah finished with my hair and makeup, I looked exactly like what she wanted, a well-cared-for elderly woman, grateful to her loving family, slightly fragile but utterly content. The party itself was a nightmare dressed up as a celebration. Sarah glided through the crowd like a swan, gracious and charming, accepting compliments about her devotion to me with just the right amount of humble deflection. "Oh, Margaret is such a joy to have in our home," she'd say, touching the arm of whoever was speaking with practiced intimacy. "She's taught me so much about grace and resilience. I'm the lucky one, really." I found myself nodding along, smiling on cue, playing the role she'd scripted for me. When David's partner asked about my health, I heard myself reciting Sarah's words, "I'm so blessed to have such caring family. Sarah makes sure I have everything I need." The lie tasted like ashes in my mouth, but the alternative, Sarah's promised consequences, seemed worse. The toast came during dessert, of course. Sarah had planned it perfectly, waiting until everyone had a glass of wine, until the mood was mellow and sentimental. She stood gracefully, her champagne flute catching the candlelight, and the room naturally quieted to listen. "I want to say something about family," she began, her voice carrying that honeyed warmth that had fooled so many people for so long. "When David and I married, I gained not just a husband, but a mother. Margaret has been living with us for several months now, and I have to tell you, it's been one of the greatest privileges of my life." The guests were already smiling, leaning in with that particular attention people give to heartwarming speeches. I felt sick. Margaret represents everything I hope to become as I age: dignified, wise, grateful for life's simple pleasures. She's taught me that caring for our elders isn't a burden, it's an honor. Every morning when I bring her her coffee, every evening when I help her with her medications, I'm reminded of how much we owe to the generation that raised us. Lies, all of it. I made my own coffee when she wasn't watching. I managed my own medications perfectly well. But the guests were nodding, some dabbing at their eyes with napkins. "Margaret, would you stand up, dear?" Sarah's voice was gentle, encouraging, but I caught the steel underneath it. I stood on unsteady legs, feeling every eye in the room on me. "I want everyone to see what grace looks like," Sarah continued, raising her glass toward me. "What it means to age with dignity, surrounded by family who loves you. Margaret, thank you for showing me what it means to put family first, always. Thank you for trusting us to care for you." The applause was thunderous. People were actually crying. Mrs. Henderson from David's office stood up, starting a spontaneous standing ovation that rippled through the room. I stood there, trapped in the spotlight of their admiration, knowing that every word was a lie but unable to speak the truth. "To Margaret," Sarah called out, and 20 voices echoed her words. "To Margaret." I raised my own glass with a trembling hand, toasting the fiction of my own contentment while my soul screamed in protest. Later, as guests filed past to tell me how lucky I was to have Sarah, how wonderful it was to see such devotion between family members, I realized the full genius of her cruelty. She hadn't just isolated me from help, she'd turned my potential rescuers into witnesses to her virtue. Every person in that room now believed they'd seen proof of Sarah's sainthood with their own eyes. If I ever tried to tell them the truth, they'd remember this night, this performance, this perfect tableau of family harmony. Sarah had built herself an army of character witnesses, and I had helped her do it. The weeks following David's birthday party marked a turning point in Sarah's treatment of me, though at the time I couldn't understand why her cruelty seemed to intensify. Looking back now, I realized that her public triumph had emboldened her. She had tested her armor of public adoration and found it impenetrable. With an army of witnesses to her sainthood, she felt free to escalate her private war against me. The physical abuse evolved from the obvious grabbing and shaking to something far more insidious, a calculated campaign of accidents and mishaps that left me constantly aching but with injuries so subtle they could always be explained away. Sarah had become an artist of inflicting pain that wouldn't show. She developed a particular talent for what I began to think of as helpful violence. When I moved too slowly down the stairs, her steadying hand on my back would include a sharp fingernail pressed between my ribs. When she assisted me into the car, her grip on my elbow would find exactly the spot where my arthritis flared worst. The pinches came disguised as affectionate pats, the twists as gentle corrections of my posture. "Careful there, Margaret," she'd say sweetly after deliberately stepping on my foot while helping me navigate around furniture. "We don't want you to trip." The concern in her voice was so convincing that sometimes I almost believed she genuinely cared, even as my toes throbbed from being ground under her heel. But it was the psychological torture that truly began to break me down. Sarah had clearly studied gaslighting the way other people study art or music, with dedication and an eye for perfection. She would move my reading glasses and then express concern about my increasing forgetfulness when I couldn't find them. She'd change the channel while I was watching my evening news program, then look puzzled when I mentioned it. "Oh, Margaret, you must be confused. You've been watching this cooking show for the past hour." The medication games were perhaps her cruelest innovation. I took a small white pill for my blood pressure every morning with breakfast, the same routine I'd maintained for 5 years. But Sarah began occasionally replacing it with an identical-looking vitamin, then expressing worry when my blood pressure readings were elevated at doctor visits. "I'm just concerned that Margaret might be forgetting her medications," she'd tell Dr. Peterson with perfectly calibrated worry, while I sat there knowing I'd never missed a dose. Sometimes I find her pills still in the container at the end of the day, but when I ask her about it, she insists she took them. I don't want to make her feel bad, but I'm starting to worry about her memory. Dr. Peterson would nod sympathetically, making notes about possible cognitive decline and medication compliance issues, while I felt my credibility dissolving like sugar in rain. How could I prove I was taking pills that Sarah had secretly replaced? How could I argue with a doctor's chart that showed elevated blood pressure readings, even when I knew the cause? The worst incident came on a Thursday morning in late June. I had been awake most of the night with a stomachache, something that had been happening more frequently since Sarah had taken over meal preparation, though I hadn't yet connected the dots. I was tired and moving slowly as I made my way to the kitchen for my morning coffee. "You look terrible, Margaret," Sarah observed as I shuffled to the coffee maker. "Are you feeling all right?" Before I could answer, she was behind me, ostensibly reaching around me to help with the coffee pot. But as she moved, her elbow connected sharply with my lower ribs, a blow so perfectly placed and timed that it looked completely accidental. The pain was immediate and breathtaking. I doubled over, gasping. "Oh my goodness!" Sarah exclaimed, her hands immediately on me in a pantomime of concern. "Margaret, what happened? Did you have a dizzy spell?" I started to say, but she was already guiding me to a chair, her grip on my arms tight enough to leave marks. "Let me help you sit down," she said, her voice loud enough to carry to David's home office down the hall. "We need to call Dr. Peterson. These dizzy spells are getting worse." "I didn't have a dizzy spell," I managed to say, but my voice came out weak and breathless from the pain. "You hit me." Sarah's face transformed for just an instant, that flash of cold satisfaction I'd learned to recognize, before concern replaced it. "Hit you?" "Margaret, sweetheart, I was just trying to help you with the coffee. You must be more confused than I thought." She raised her voice slightly. "David. Can you come here? Your mother had another episode." By the time David appeared in the kitchen doorway, Sarah had positioned herself as the concerned caregiver and me as the confused patient. The evidence was all on her side. I was bent over in obvious distress, she was standing protectively nearby, and my accusation sounded exactly like what it was, the desperate claim of someone whose grip on reality was being systematically undermined. "Mom, what's wrong?" David asked, genuine worry in his voice. "She says I hit her," Sarah said softly, her voice heavy with hurt and concern. I was just trying to help her with the coffee maker, and she suddenly doubled over. "I think she might have had another dizzy spell, but she seems to think I caused it somehow." I watched my son's face as he processed this information, saw the doubt creep into his eyes as he looked at me, his confused, possibly declining mother, and then at Sarah, his patient, caring wife who had never given him any reason to doubt her version of events. "I think we should call Dr. Peterson," David said finally, and I knew I had lost another battle in a war I was only beginning to understand I was fighting. The worst part wasn't the physical pain or even the humiliation. It was the growing certainty that I was losing myself, that the woman I had been for 72 years was being erased and replaced by someone I didn't recognize, someone weak, confused, and completely dependent on the very person who was destroying her. The evening of July 15th will forever be seared into my memory as the night I realized Sarah wasn't just cruel, she was dangerous. What started as another family gathering designed to showcase her perfection nearly ended with me at the bottom of a flight of stairs with a broken neck. David had invited his boss, Mr. Garrison, and his wife for dinner, another opportunity for Sarah to display her domestic goddess persona. I had been relegated to my usual role as the grateful elderly mother-in-law, dressed in my good clothes and coached on appropriate responses to any questions about my well-being. The evening was progressing according to Sarah's script until I made the mistake that would change everything. Mrs. Garrison had complimented the beautiful table setting, and Sarah was accepting praise for her attention to detail when I reached across the table for the water pitcher. My arthritis had been particularly bad that day, making my movements stiff and unpredictable. As I lifted the pitcher, my hand trembled slightly, and disaster struck in slow motion. The white wine, Sarah's precious $30 bottle that she'd been saving for special occasions, cascaded across the pristine white tablecloth like blood across fresh snow. The burgundy stain spread instantly, soaking into the fabric and pooling around her carefully arranged centerpiece. The silence that followed was deafening. "Oh no!" I gasped, immediately reaching for my napkin. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. Let me." "It's perfectly fine," Sarah said, her voice tight but controlled, that familiar flash of rage quickly masked by her public persona. "Accidents happen." But I caught the look she shot me across the table, a promise of retribution that made my blood run cold. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced normalcy. Sarah cleaned up the spill with gracious efficiency, assuring our guests that the tablecloth was nothing special, and that these things happened all the time with elderly family members. She even managed to turn it into another showcase of her saintly patience, joking gently about how she'd learned to keep extra linens handy since I'd moved in. But I knew. Sitting there listening to Mrs. Garrison praise Sarah's remarkable grace under pressure, I knew that the moment our guests left, I would pay for my clumsiness in ways that would make all her previous punishments seem gentle. The Garrisons lingered until nearly 10 o'clock, and with each passing minute, I felt my dread growing like a tumor in my chest. David walked them to their car while Sarah began clearing the dishes with mechanical precision, her movements sharp and aggressive despite the pleasant smile she maintained. "Such a lovely evening," she said conversationally as she stacked plates with unnecessary force. "Though I suppose we'll need to discuss being more careful around nice things, won't we, Margaret?" When David returned from seeing off our guests, Sarah was the picture of composed domesticity, loading the dishwasher while humming softly. "Your mother seems to be having more difficulty with her coordination lately," she mentioned casually, not looking up from her task. "Maybe we should think about having her eat in the kitchen from now on, just to be safe." "That seems a bit extreme," David said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "It was just an accident." "Of course it was," Sarah agreed smoothly. "I'm not blaming her. I just think we need to be more careful about putting her in situations where she might hurt herself. Or damage things." David headed upstairs to bed around 11, exhausted from the day. I waited, sitting rigidly in my chair in the living room, knowing that Sarah would come for me once she was certain he was asleep. The house settled into quiet, broken only by the sound of Sarah's methodical cleaning in the kitchen. She appeared in the doorway at 11:30, her public mask finally discarded like a costume after a performance. The woman standing before me bore no resemblance to the gracious hostess who had charmed our dinner guests. This was someone else entirely, someone whose eyes held the cold calculation of a predator who had cornered its prey. $30, she said quietly, moving toward me with deliberate slowness. "That wine cost $30, and it was a gift from David's colleague. Do you have any idea how that made me look?" I opened my mouth to apologize again, but she cut me off with a sharp gesture. "No," she said, her voice dropping to that whisper I'd learned to fear. "You don't get to speak. You've done enough for one evening." She was close enough now that I could smell her perfume, see the carefully controlled fury in her face. "You embarrassed me in front of David's boss. You made me look like I can't control my own household." Before I could react, her hands were on my shoulders, yanking me up from the chair with a violence that sent shooting pains through my arthritic joints. "I think it's time you learned what happens when you make me look bad." She began pushing me toward the basement door, her grip iron tight on my upper arms. "Sarah, please," I whispered, but she was beyond reason now, driven by a fury that seemed to feed on itself. "The basement stairs can be so dangerous for elderly people," she said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "So many accidents happen on stairs. People lose their balance, take a tumble." She opened the basement door, and I stared down into the darkness below, understanding with crystal clarity what she intended. "Sarah, don't," I started, but her shove came without warning, violent and decisive. I felt my feet leave the top step, felt gravity take hold as I tumbled forward into the darkness. The impact came in stages, my shoulder hitting the wall, my hip slamming into the wooden steps, my wrist bending at an impossible angle as I tried to break my fall. By the time I reached the concrete floor at the bottom, my body was a symphony of pain, and I knew with dizzying certainty that something was very, very wrong with my left wrist. Above me, I could hear Sarah's voice, raised in perfectly calibrated panic. "David. David, come quickly. Your mother fell down the basement stairs." The emergency room fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I lay on the gurney, my left wrist throbbing in a cast that would serve as my constant reminder of how close I'd come to dying that night. The doctor had explained that I was remarkably lucky, the fracture was clean, the bruising extensive but not life-threatening, and somehow I'd avoided hitting my head on the concrete floor. Sarah stood beside my bed, her hand resting protectively on my good arm, the picture of a devoted daughter-in-law racked with guilt over her mother-in-law's terrible accident. "I should have insisted on better lighting in that basement," she was telling the nurse, her voice thick with manufactured remorse. "Poor Margaret was just trying to help me bring up some storage boxes. I never should have let her go down those stairs alone." But I knew the truth. As I lay there listening to her weave another masterpiece of deception, something fundamental shifted inside me. The physical pain from my injuries was nothing compared to the burning realization that Sarah had tried to seriously hurt me, maybe even kill me. The basement fall wasn't discipline or punishment, it was attempted murder disguised as an accident. That night, as Sarah fussed over me with her usual public show of concern, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to document what was happening to me, and I was going to do it carefully, methodically, and secretly. If Sarah wanted to play the long game, then so would I. The first challenge was learning to use my phone's camera with one hand while my dominant wrist healed. David had bought me a smartphone the previous Christmas, insisting I needed to stay connected, though Sarah had effectively eliminated most of my connections. Now, that same device would become my weapon against her. I started with the bruises from the basement fall. Late at night, when Sarah thought I was asleep, would carefully photograph the purple and yellow marks that bloomed across my ribs, my hip, my shoulder. The bathroom mirror became my ally, reflecting angles that showed the extent of damage Sarah had inflicted. Each photo was dated automatically by the phone, creating a timeline that even Sarah's silver tongue couldn't explain away. The documentation process taught me things about my own abuse that I'd been too frightened or confused to recognize. Looking at the photos objectively, like evidence rather than my own pain, I could see patterns. The finger-shaped bruises on my upper arms weren't random, they were exactly where someone would grab to shake or control another person. The marks on my wrists weren't from helping me steady myself, as Sarah always claimed, they were restraint injuries. I began keeping a journal, hidden inside one of Harold's old books that Sarah had never bothered to examine. Every incident, no matter how small, went into that journal with dates, times, and detailed descriptions. The pinches disguised as affectionate pats. The accidental steps on my feet. The medication games that left me dizzy and confused during doctor visits. Writing it all down was like archaeology, excavating a pattern of abuse that had been buried under months of gaslighting and self-doubt. The most crucial breakthrough came 3 weeks after the basement incident. Sarah had been particularly cruel that morning, twisting my healing wrist during what looked like a gentle examination of my cast. The pain had been excruciating, but her performance of concern was flawless, until she thought I'd left the room. I had forgotten my reading glasses on the kitchen counter and was returning to retrieve them when I heard her voice from the living room. She was on the phone with someone, and her tone was completely different from the worried caregiver voice she used around David and in public. Getting tired of the whole act, she was saying, her voice cold and irritated. The old bat is more trouble than she's worth. I swear, sometimes I think it would be easier if she just had another accident and didn't get up this time. My hands shook as I activated my phone's recording app, praying it would pick up her voice from the next room. For the next 5 minutes, I listened to Sarah complain to whoever was on the other end about the burden of caring for me, about how she was counting the days until I was no longer her problem, and most chillingly, about how no one would question it if an elderly woman with my history of falls had a fatal accident. When she hung up, I slipped quietly back to my room, my heart pounding so hard I was sure she could hear it. But I had done it. I had recorded Sarah's true voice, her real feelings, her actual intentions toward me. For the first time in months, I felt something I'd almost forgotten: hope. The evidence gathering became my secret mission, giving me purpose beyond mere survival. I learned to be strategic about when and how I documented Sarah's abuse. I discovered that my phone automatically backed up photos to something called the cloud, which meant even if Sarah found and destroyed my device, the evidence would still exist somewhere she couldn't reach. I began researching elder abuse online during the brief periods when Sarah left the house for errands. What I found was both heartbreaking and empowering: I wasn't alone. There were organizations specifically designed to help people like me, social workers who specialized in elder abuse, legal protections I didn't know existed. Most importantly, I learned that what was happening to me had a name: intimate partner violence committed against elderly family members. Reading those clinical descriptions of my daily reality was like finally finding the right words for a pain I'd been carrying without language. Each piece of evidence I gathered felt like reclaiming a small piece of myself from Sarah's control. She might be able to fool David, the doctors, our neighbors, and dinner party guests, but she couldn't erase the truth when it was documented, dated, and stored beyond her reach. The woman who had been pushed down those basement stairs was a victim. But the woman who was methodically building a case against her abuser, that woman was a survivor, and she was just getting started. Armed with weeks of carefully documented evidence, I finally felt ready to reach out for help. The photos on my phone showed a clear pattern of abuse, my hidden journal detailed months of escalating violence, and I had Sarah's recorded voice admitting she wished I would die in another accident. Surely, I thought, this evidence would be enough to make someone believe me. I was about to learn just how formidable Sarah's public image had become. My first call was to Adult Protective Services, a number I'd found during one of my secret internet research sessions. My heart hammered as I dialed, clutching the phone with my good hand while Sarah was at her weekly yoga class. When a tired-sounding woman named Janet answered, I felt a surge of hope. "I need help," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "My daughter-in-law is abusing me. She pushed me down the stairs 3 weeks ago and broke my wrist. I have pictures of the bruises, and I recorded her saying she wishes I would have another accident and die." Janet's tone shifted to professional concern. "I'm sorry to hear that, Mrs. Chen. We take these allegations very seriously. I can schedule a home visit for next Tuesday. Will that work for you?" Tuesday came, and with it, my first devastating lesson in how easily Sarah could manipulate trained professionals. I watched from my bedroom window as Janet approached our front door, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a clipboard, someone who I desperately hoped would see through Sarah's performance. Sarah answered the door in her gardening clothes, dirt smudged attractively on her cheek, looking like she'd been lovingly tending to our flower beds. "Oh, you must be from Adult Protective Services," she said with perfect surprise. "Please, come in. I'm so glad you're here." From my position at the top of the stairs, I could hear every word of their conversation. Sarah's performance was Oscar-worthy. She explained how concerned she'd been about my increasing confusion and paranoia since Harold's death. She described finding me talking to people who weren't there, insisting that family members had said things they'd never said, becoming convinced that people were trying to hurt me. The fall down the basement stairs was particularly upsetting, Sarah said, her voice heavy with genuine-sounding worry. She was convinced I pushed her, but I was upstairs in bed when it happened. David found her at the bottom of the stairs in the morning. The doctor said elderly people often confabulate memories around traumatic events, especially when there's cognitive decline involved. When Janet asked to speak with me, Sarah's concern deepened. Of course, though I should warn you, she's been having more bad days lately. Sometimes she recognizes me, sometimes she thinks I'm a stranger trying to hurt her. It's heartbreaking. I came downstairs prepared to show Janet my evidence, to play the recording of Sarah's true voice, to reveal the photos of bruises that couldn't be explained by simple falls. But the moment I saw the doubt in Janet's eyes, the way she looked at me like I was already a confused old woman whose reality couldn't be trusted, I felt my confidence crumble. Mrs. Chen, Janet said gently, your daughter-in-law tells me you've been having some confusion lately. Can you tell me about the night you fell down the stairs? She pushed me, I said, but my voice came out weak and uncertain. I have proof. I recorded her. Mom, Sarah interrupted softly, moving to my side with practiced grace, we talked about this, remember? You were sleepwalking that night. Dr. Peterson explained that the new medication can cause confusion and sleepwalking in elderly patients. I stared at her in disbelief. There was no new medication. Dr. Peterson had never mentioned sleepwalking. But Sarah's lie was delivered with such conviction, such apparent concern, that I saw Janet's expression shift from professional skepticism to sympathetic understanding. The rest of Janet's visit was a formality. She spoke to David when he came home from work, and he corroborated Sarah's version of events, not maliciously, but because it was the only version he'd been given. He spoke about my increasing episodes of confusion, my unfounded accusations against Sarah, and his gratitude for his wife's incredible patience in dealing with my decline. Janet left with assurances that she would check back in a few months, but I could see in her eyes that she considered the case closed. In her notes, I was sure I would be classified as an elderly woman with cognitive issues making unfounded accusations against her devoted caregiver. My second attempt at getting help came 2 weeks later, when I called our family pastor during one of Sarah's grocery shopping trips. Pastor Williams had known me for 15 years, surely he would recognize the truth in my voice. Pastor Williams, I said when he answered, I need to talk to someone. Sarah is hurting me, and I don't know what to do. His response was kind but devastating. Oh, Margaret, he said gently, I've been so impressed by Sarah's dedication to caring for you. She was just here last week, asking for prayers for strength as she deals with your increasing needs. She mentioned that you've been having some confusion, seeing threats where there aren't any. She's been talking to you about me? I asked, my heart sinking. Only out of love and concern, Pastor Williams assured me. She's worried about you, Margaret. Maybe instead of seeing threats, you should try to appreciate the blessing of having someone so devoted to your care. Have you been praying for patience and gratitude? Sometimes when we focus on our fears, we miss God's gifts. I hung up feeling more alone than ever. Sarah hadn't just isolated me from my friends and family, she had poisoned the wells of help before I'd even thought to drink from them. Every potential ally had already been converted into a witness to her virtue and my decline. My final attempt came during a routine doctor's visit. Dr. Peterson examined my healing wrist with professional efficiency while Sarah sat nearby, the picture of concerned family support. Doctor, I said quietly, I need to tell you something privately. Dr. Peterson glanced at Sarah, who immediately stood up. Of course, she said graciously. I'll just wait outside. The moment she left, I pulled out my phone, desperate to show him the photos of my bruises, to play the recording of her threats. But Dr. Peterson gently pushed the phone away. "Margaret," he said kindly, "Sarah already explained about your increasing paranoia and confusion. These photos could be from any number of falls or bumps, elderly skin bruises very easily. And recordings can be taken out of context or even fabricated with today's technology." "But I'm not confused," I protested. "I'm completely lucid. She's abusing me." Dr. Peterson made a note in my chart. "I'm going to recommend we start you on a mild anti-anxiety medication. Sometimes these paranoid episodes can be managed with the right treatment." As I sat there watching him write orders for medication to treat the paranoia of reporting my own abuse, I realized the horrible genius of Sarah's strategy. She hadn't just built herself an unassailable reputation, she had systematically destroyed mine. In every system designed to protect people like me, I was now classified as the problem, not the victim. The very people who should have been my rescue had become my jailers, and I was more trapped than ever. Tommy's 8-year-old eyes saw everything with the brutal clarity that only children possess, unfiltered by adult assumptions about what should or shouldn't be happening in a family home. My great-nephew had always been special to me, David's sister Karen's youngest boy, a curious child with Harold's same thoughtful way of watching the world. I never expected that his innocent presence during a routine family visit would become both my salvation and my greatest fear. Karen had brought the kids over on a Sunday afternoon in late August, one of those sweltering days when even the air conditioning seemed to struggle. The adults were gathered in the living room, Sarah orchestrating another perfect family tableau while dispensing iced tea and homemade cookies. Tommy, restless and bored by adult conversation, had wandered into the kitchen where I was slowly arranging fruit in a bowl with my good hand, a task Sarah had assigned me to keep me useful and occupied. I was concentrating on balancing an apple when Sarah swept into the kitchen, her public smile vanishing the moment she realized we were alone. The transition from gracious hostess to cold predator happened so quickly that I barely had time to brace myself. "You're taking too long with that," she hissed, moving behind me with that familiar predatory grace. "Karen's been asking why you're not socializing. Do you want her to think you're being antisocial and difficult?" "I'm trying," I whispered, my hands trembling as I reached for another piece of fruit. "My wrist still." "Your wrist is fine," Sarah cut me off, her voice dropping to that dangerous whisper I'd learned to fear. "You're just being dramatic, as usual. Manipulating everyone's sympathy with your poor little me act." What happened next occurred so quickly that I almost missed it myself. Sarah's hand shot out, grabbing my healing wrist and twisting it with vicious precision. The pain was immediate and breathtaking, white-hot agony that sent the apple tumbling from my grasp to roll across the kitchen floor. My gasp of pain was involuntary, desperate, and apparently loud enough to mask the sound of small footsteps returning to the kitchen. "There," Sarah said with cold satisfaction, her grip tightening as tears sprang to my eyes. "Maybe now you'll..." "Aunt Sarah." Tommy's small voice from the doorway cut through the kitchen like a knife. Sarah released my wrist so quickly that I stumbled against the counter, and when I turned, I saw my great-nephew standing in the entrance, his eyes wide with confusion and something that looked like fear. Sarah's transformation was instantaneous and horrifying to witness. The cold predator vanished, replaced by the warm, caring woman everyone else knew. "Oh, Tommy," she exclaimed, her voice bright with false cheer. "You startled me. Great-Grandma Margaret and I were she was having trouble with her sore wrist, and I was trying to help her." But Tommy wasn't looking at Sarah. His eyes were fixed on me, taking in my pale face, my protective stance over my wrist, the tears I was trying to blink away. Children, I realized, don't automatically accept adult explanations the way grown-ups do. They trust what they see more than what they're told. "Great-Grandma Margaret," Tommy said quietly, "are you okay? You look scared." The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire that couldn't be hidden. Sarah's laugh was too bright, too forced. "Scared? Oh goodness, no. Margaret just got a little startled when I moved too quickly to help her. You know how jumpy we get when we're older. Tommy continued to stare at me with those serious 8-year-old eyes, and I saw something shift in his expression, a dawning understanding that what he'd witnessed didn't match what he was being told. He was too young to articulate what he'd seen, but old enough to recognize that something was wrong. "Great-grandma," he said, moving closer to me, "why were you making that hurt noise if Aunt Sarah was helping?" Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Sometimes helping can be uncomfortable, sweetie. Like when your mom takes you to get shots at the doctor. It hurts for a moment, but it's good for you." But Tommy wasn't buying it. I could see the questions forming in his young mind, questions that Sarah's smooth explanations couldn't quite answer. Why did Great-Grandma Margaret look afraid? Why did helping look like hurting? Why was Aunt Sarah's voice different when she thought no one was listening? The rest of the afternoon passed in a strange tension. Tommy stayed close to me, his small presence both protective and protective-seeking. He helped me with simple tasks, chattering about school and friends, but I caught him watching Sarah with new wariness whenever she approached me. When she offered to help me to the bathroom, Tommy immediately piped up that he would help instead, taking my good hand with surprising determination. Later, as the family gathered to say goodbye, I watched Tommy whispering urgently to his mother near the front door. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but I saw Karen's eyes flick toward me with new concern. She approached as I sat in my usual chair, kneeling down so we were at eye level. "Margaret," she said quietly, "Tommy mentioned that you seemed upset earlier. Are you feeling all right? Is everything okay here?" The moment hung between us like a bridge I could either cross or burn. Sarah was across the room, seemingly engrossed in conversation with David, but I knew she was listening to every word. One truthful sentence could change everything, or it could make things so much worse for both Tommy and me. "I'm fine, dear," I heard myself saying, the lie scraping against my throat like broken glass. You know how children can misinterpret things. Tommy's such a sweet, sensitive boy. Karen studied my face for a long moment, and I saw doubt flicker in her eyes. But like so many adults faced with the uncomfortable possibility of family dysfunction, she chose to accept my words rather than pursue the harder truth. As they prepared to leave, Tommy broke away from his mother and ran back to me. He wrapped his small arms around my neck in a fierce hug, and whispered something that made my heart skip a beat. "Great-grandma, if someone is being mean to you, you should tell. That's what my teacher says. Even if the mean person says not to tell." I hugged him back, breathing in his little boy scent of sunshine and bubble gum, knowing that this 8-year-old child had just offered me something that no adult had, unconditional belief in my reality and a simple truth about speaking up against bullies. After they left, Sarah's retribution was swift and painful, but for the first time in months, I felt something that had been missing from my life: hope. Someone had witnessed her true nature. Someone believed what they'd seen with their own eyes, regardless of her explanations. Tommy had given me something more valuable than evidence or documentation. He'd given me an ally who was too young to be fooled by Sarah's performance and too innocent to doubt what he'd seen. But he'd also given me something terrifying, the knowledge that my silence wasn't protecting just me anymore. Tommy's innocent questions to his mother about why Aunt Sarah was mean to me had planted the first seeds of doubt in our extended family, and I knew I had to act before Sarah found a way to explain them away. His 8-year-old witness testimony, combined with my growing collection of evidence, finally gave me the courage to reach beyond the local systems that had failed me and seek help from people who specialized in exactly what I was experiencing. My breakthrough came during one of Sarah's increasingly rare absences from the house. She had gone to her monthly book club, another opportunity to showcase her devotion to caring for her declining mother-in-law, and I had perhaps 2 hours of unsupervised internet access. Instead of my usual careful research sessions, I decided to take a bigger risk and actually make contact with the outside world. The National Elder Abuse Hotline felt like my last hope as I dialed the number with trembling fingers. When a warm voice answered with "Elder Abuse Hotline, this is Monica speaking," I nearly broke down crying at the simple relief of speaking to someone whose job was to believe elderly people like me. "My name is Margaret Chen," I said, my voice stronger than it had been in months. "I'm 72 years old, and my daughter-in-law has been abusing me for almost a year. I've tried to get help, but everyone thinks she's wonderful and I'm confused. I have evidence, but I don't know what to do with it." Monica's response was everything I desperately needed to hear. "Margaret, I believe you. What you're describing is unfortunately very common, and you're absolutely right that elder abuse perpetrators often have excellent public reputations. Can you tell me about your living situation and what kind of evidence you've collected?" For the next 20 minutes, I poured out my story to someone who didn't interrupt with explanations about my confusion or suggestions that I should be grateful for Sarah's care. Monica asked detailed questions about my safety, the frequency of incidents, and whether I had access to transportation or financial resources. Most importantly, she asked about my evidence. "The photos and recordings you've described are exactly the kind of documentation we need," she said. "And the fact that your great-nephew witnessed an incident is significant. Children often make very credible witnesses because they haven't learned to rationalize away what they see. I'm going to connect you with a social worker in your area who specializes in elder abuse cases, someone who won't be fooled by your daughter-in-law's public persona." Monica gave me the name and direct number of Lisa Rodriguez, a social worker with the county's specialized elder abuse unit, apparently a different department from the General Adult Protective Services that had dismissed my case. More importantly, she taught me how to create a safety plan. "Margaret, if your daughter-in-law pushed you downstairs once, she's capable of doing it again," Monica said bluntly. "We need to think about your immediate safety while we build a case. Do you have anywhere you could go if you needed to leave quickly?" I thought about Karen, Tommy's mother, who had seemed genuinely concerned after her son's questions. "Maybe my nephew's wife," I said. She seemed worried after Tommy told her something was wrong. "Good. I want you to find a way to have a private conversation with her. Don't worry about having all the evidence perfect, sometimes family members just need to know that it's okay to trust their instincts. If a child is saying something's wrong, there usually is." After we hung up, I felt energized in a way I hadn't experienced since before Harold's death. Someone believed me. Someone with professional training and experience had listened to my story and confirmed that what I was experiencing was real, serious, and not my fault. I spent the remaining time before Sarah's return organizing my evidence more systematically. The photos on my phone were already date-stamped, but I created a document that explained each image, when it was taken, what had caused the injury, and what Sarah's explanation had been afterward. The recording of her phone conversation went into a separate folder with notes about the context and timing. Most importantly, I started researching hidden camera options. Monica had mentioned that video evidence was the gold standard for elder abuse cases, and I realized that my phone's camera could serve this purpose if I positioned it carefully during times when Sarah was likely to lose control. The next morning, I called Karen while Sarah was in the shower. My hands were shaking, but Tommy's innocent courage had shown me that sometimes the truth was simple: if someone is being mean to you, you should tell. "Karen," I said quickly, "I need to talk to you about what Tommy saw the other day. He was right to be worried. Sarah has been hurting me, and I need help." The silence that followed felt eternal, but when Karen finally spoke, her voice was filled with a mixture of concern and guilt. "Margaret, I've been thinking about what Tommy said. He's been asking me questions I don't know how to answer. He keeps saying that Aunt Sarah was hurting you and that your crying sound was different from when you're sad. Can you tell me what's really happening?" For the first time in almost a year, I told the complete truth to someone who had the power to help me. I explained about the isolation, the escalating violence, the basement stairs, and the systematic way Sarah had convinced everyone that I was declining mentally. I told her about the evidence I'd collected and the social worker who was willing to investigate. "Oh my God, Margaret," Karen whispered. I knew something felt wrong, but Sarah always seemed so devoted, so patient. I feel terrible that I didn't push harder when Tommy tried to tell me. You're pushing now, I said. That's what matters. Karen became my first real ally in building a case against Sarah. She agreed to document Tommy's account of what he'd witnessed, to provide a safe place for me to stay if needed, and most importantly, to contact other family members who might have noticed things they'd dismissed or explained away. My mom mentioned that you seemed different lately, Karen said. Quieter, more nervous. She said Sarah told her it was normal aging, but now I'm wondering what else we've all missed. As I hung up the phone, I realized that Sarah's greatest strength, her ability to control narratives and manage perceptions, was about to become her greatest weakness. She'd been so focused on building her perfect reputation that she'd never considered what would happen if someone finally started asking the right questions. Tommy's innocent witness testimony had cracked open a door that adult skepticism had kept firmly shut. Now it was time to kick that door down completely and let the light in on Sarah's carefully constructed darkness. The scared, isolated woman who had been pushed down basement stairs was gone. In her place stood someone who understood that silence enabled abusers, and that the truth, properly documented and presented to the right people, had its own power that no amount of charm or reputation could overcome. The morning of September 23 arrived with an unseasonable chill that seemed to mirror the ice forming in my chest as I watched Lisa Rodriguez park her county vehicle in our driveway. Behind her, a police cruiser pulled up with Officer Martinez, who Lisa had warned me would need to be present given the potential criminal nature of my allegations. After weeks of careful planning and evidence gathering, the moment of truth had finally arrived. Sarah was in the kitchen preparing her usual elaborate breakfast presentation when the doorbell rang. I heard her footsteps pause, then the familiar sound of her quickly checking her appearance in the hallway mirror before answering the door. Even facing an unannounced visit from authorities, her instinct was to ensure her public persona was perfectly in place. "Good morning," I heard her say in that honeyed voice that had fooled so many people. "I'm Sarah Chen. How can I help you?" "Mrs. Chen, I'm Lisa Rodriguez from the County Elder Abuse Unit, and this is Officer Martinez. We're here to speak with Margaret Chen regarding some concerns that have been brought to our attention." The silence that followed was brief but telling. When Sarah spoke again, her voice carried just the right note of surprised concern. "Of course, please come in. I have to say, I'm a bit confused about what this might be regarding, but Margaret is in the living room. She's been having some difficult days lately, some confusion and memory issues, but I'm sure she'll be happy to speak with you." I was sitting in my usual chair when they entered, but for the first time in months, I wasn't hunched over in defensive fear. Lisa had coached me extensively about this moment, reminding me that I was no longer alone, that my evidence spoke for itself, and that trained professionals would be able to see through Sarah's performance. "Mrs. Chen," Lisa said, approaching me with genuine warmth, "I'm Lisa Rodriguez. We spoke on the phone last week. How are you feeling today?" "I'm feeling ready," I said clearly, my voice steadier than it had been in almost a year. "Ready to tell the truth about what's been happening in this house." Sarah positioned herself in her usual spot, perched on the edge of the sofa with perfect posture, ready to provide loving support and gentle corrections to whatever confused narrative I might offer. But Lisa had already moved beyond the preliminary small talk that had allowed Sarah to control previous interviews. "Mrs. Chen, you've provided us with some very detailed documentation of incidents of physical abuse, emotional manipulation, and threats. Can you tell us about the night you were pushed down the basement stairs?" The directness of the question clearly caught Sarah off guard. I saw her face flicker with that familiar flash of rage before she composed herself. "I'm sorry," she said, "but I think there's been some misunderstanding. Margaret wasn't pushed down any stairs. She had a fall, a terrible accident that we reported to her doctor. I think her memory of that night might be affected by the trauma of the fall itself." "Actually," Lisa said, pulling out a tablet, "we have a recording that suggests otherwise. Mrs. Chen, would you like to play the audio file you provided us?" I watched Sarah's face as my phone connected to Lisa's portable speaker and her own voice filled our living room. The cold, irritated tone was unmistakable as she complained about the burden of caring for me and speculated about how no one would question it if I had another fatal accident. The transformation in Sarah was immediate and terrifying. The mask of concerned caregiver didn't just slip, it shattered completely. Her face went completely pale, then flushed red with rage as she realized the extent of what I had documented. That's taken out of context," she stammered, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. "I was just venting frustration to a friend. Everyone gets frustrated when caregiving becomes overwhelming." Officer Martinez stepped forward. "Ma'am, in that recording, you specifically discuss how easy it would be to cause fatal harm to Mrs. Chen and make it appear accidental. That constitutes a terroristic threat under state law." Sarah's eyes darted between the officer, Lisa, and me, and I saw something I'd never seen before, genuine fear. For the first time since I'd known her, Sarah Chen was not in control of the narrative. "Where is David?" she asked suddenly, her voice rising. "This is ridiculous. David will tell you how devoted I've been to Margaret's care. I've sacrificed everything to take care of her." "Mr. Chen is being interviewed separately," Lisa said calmly. "We've also spoken with your nephew Tommy, whose account of witnessing you physically assault Mrs. Chen corroborates her testimony." The mention of Tommy seemed to break something in Sarah. She turned to me with pure venom in her eyes, her public mask completely abandoned. "You stupid old bitch," she hissed. "You involved a child in your pathetic fantasy. You're going to destroy this family with your lies." "Mrs. Chen," Officer Martinez said firmly, "I need you to step away from Mrs. Chen and keep your voice down." But Sarah was beyond reason now, months of carefully controlled rage finally erupting. "Lies," she screamed. "All of it. I've given up my life to take care of this ungrateful, senile old woman, and this is how she repays me. She's losing her mind and trying to take me down with her." Lisa was recording everything on her phone, documenting Sarah's complete breakdown of her caring facade. "Mrs. Chen, the physical evidence we've reviewed, the photographs of injuries, the medical records, the testimony from witnesses, all supports a pattern of systematic abuse. Your reaction right now is also being documented." David chose that moment to arrive home early from work, walking into a scene that must have looked like something from a nightmare. His wife was screaming accusations at his mother while a police officer and social worker documented everything. The perfect family image he'd believed in was crumbling in real time. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah immediately tried to regain control, smoothing her hair and modulating her voice. "David, thank God you're here. They're accusing me of hurting your mother based on some confused stories and taken out of context recordings. Tell them how much I've sacrificed to care for her." But David was looking at me, really looking at me, for the first time in months. I saw him taking in my fearful posture, the way I instinctively leaned away from Sarah, the evidence spread across Lisa's tablet. His face went through a series of expressions: confusion, denial, dawning horror, and finally, devastating recognition. "Mom," he said quietly, "is it true? Has Sarah been hurting you?" The question hung in the air like a bridge between the woman I'd been and the woman I was becoming. For almost a year, I'd been silenced by fear, isolation, and manipulation. Now, surrounded by people whose job it was to believe and protect me, I finally had the chance to speak my truth to the person whose opinion mattered most. "Yes," I said, my voice clear and strong. "It's all true, David. Every word." I watched my son's face crumble as the full weight of what had been happening in his own home finally hit him. Sarah's perfect reputation, her carefully constructed image, her months of manipulation, all of it collapsed in that single moment of truth. The scared, isolated victim who had been pushed down basement stairs was gone forever. In her place stood a survivor who had found her voice and refused to be silenced anymore. The sound of handcuffs clicking around Sarah's wrists was the most beautiful sound I'd heard in almost a year. Officer Martinez read her rights in a calm, professional voice while she alternated between pleading innocence and hurling accusations at me. Even as she was being arrested for elder abuse, assault, and making terroristic threats, Sarah couldn't resist one final attempt at manipulation. "David," she called out as they led her toward the door. "Don't let them do this to us. She's sick, she's confused. I've devoted my life to caring for her, and this is how she repays me." But David was standing beside my chair now, his hand resting protectively on my shoulder, the first genuinely caring touch I'd received from family in months. The man who had unknowingly enabled my abuse by believing Sarah's lies was looking at his wife with horror and disgust. "Don't," he said quietly, his voice thick with guilt and anger. "Just don't, Sarah. I've seen the evidence. I've heard the recordings. I know what you did to my mother." The legal process that followed was both more difficult and more validating than I had expected. District Attorney Patricia Coleman explained that elder abuse cases were among the hardest to prosecute because victims were often viewed as unreliable witnesses, but she was confident in our case. "Mrs. Chen," she told me during our first meeting, "your documentation is extraordinary. The photographs, the recordings, the witness testimony, you've essentially built our case for us. Your great-nephew Tommy's account is particularly powerful because children his age rarely fabricate detailed stories about adult behavior they don't understand the context for." The hardest part was testifying at Sarah's preliminary hearing. Sitting in that courtroom, speaking into a microphone about the intimate details of my abuse while Sarah sat at the defendant's table glaring at me, required every ounce of courage I'd spent months building. But Lisa Rodriguez sat in the front row, and David was beside me, and I could feel Tommy's innocent bravery giving me strength. Sarah's defense attorney tried the expected strategy, portraying her as a devoted caregiver overwhelmed by the burden of caring for an elderly woman with declining mental faculties. But my evidence spoke louder than his arguments. When they played the recording of Sarah discussing how easy it would be to kill me and make it look accidental, I watched the judge's expression harden. "Mrs. Chen," Judge Harrison said, addressing Sarah directly, "I've seen many elder abuse cases in my courtroom, but rarely have I encountered such calculated, predatory behavior. Your recorded statements demonstrate clear premeditation and a callous disregard for the life and dignity of a vulnerable family member." Sarah was sentenced to 3 years in prison for elder abuse, assault, and making terroristic threats. The judge also issued a permanent restraining order preventing her from contacting me or coming within 500 feet of wherever I lived. Civil court was next, where Sarah would face financial consequences for the medical bills, therapy costs, and pain and suffering she had caused. But the legal victory, satisfying as it was, couldn't undo the damage to our family. David struggled with overwhelming guilt about his role in enabling the abuse. The night after Sarah's sentencing, he sat in my new apartment, a cozy one-bedroom place I'd chosen for myself, and wept like a child. "Mom, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I should have seen it. I should have protected you. She convinced me you were declining, and I believed her instead of believing you. I failed you when you needed me most." "David," I said gently, "Sarah fooled everyone. She fooled social workers, doctors, our pastor, our friends. She was very, very good at what she did. The important thing is that when you finally saw the truth, you believed it and you acted on it." David filed for divorce within a week of Sarah's conviction, though the legal proceedings would take months. The house that had been my prison was sold, and David used his portion to help me get established in my new life. He insisted on paying for the therapy I needed to process the trauma of what I'd endured. My extended family rallied around me in ways I hadn't expected. Karen and the kids visited regularly, and Tommy, now older and more aware of what his brave questions had accomplished, became my fierce protector. "Great-grandma," he told me one afternoon, "I'm glad I told on Aunt Sarah. My teacher was right about telling when people are mean." The community reaction was perhaps the most interesting aspect of the aftermath. People who had praised Sarah's devotion to me now claimed they'd always sensed something was off about her. The same neighbors who had celebrated her saintly care suddenly remembered occasions when they'd noticed me looking nervous or withdrawn. It was remarkable how quickly everyone revised their memories once the truth was undeniable. Dr. Peterson, to his credit, called me personally to apologize for dismissing my concerns and to discuss how medical professionals could better recognize elder abuse. "Margaret," he said, "I've been practicing for 30 years, and your case has taught me things I should have known all along. I won't make the same mistakes again." But the most meaningful consequence wasn't legal or financial, it was personal. For the first time since Harold's death, I felt like myself again. The woman who had been slowly erased by months of abuse and gaslighting was gone, replaced by someone stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to live life on her own terms. I began volunteering with the elder abuse unit that had helped me, sharing my story with other victims and their families. Many of them came to me broken and doubting their own perceptions, just as I had been. I showed them that documentation was power, that the truth had its own strength, and that even the most convincing abusers could be exposed and stopped. Sarah had tried to erase me, to reduce me to a confused, grateful burden who would disappear quietly when it became convenient. Instead, she had created something she never expected, a survivor with a voice, a story, and an unshakable determination to ensure that what happened to me would never happen to anyone else if I could prevent it. Justice, I learned, wasn't just about punishment, it was about reclaiming the truth, rebuilding trust, and transforming pain into purpose. Sarah was in prison, but I was finally free. 6 months after Sarah's conviction, I stood at the podium in the Riverside Community Center, looking out at an audience of 43 people who had come to hear me speak about elder abuse recognition and prevention. My hands weren't shaking anymore when I held a microphone, a small miracle that would have seemed impossible during those dark months when Sarah controlled every aspect of my existence. "My name is Margaret Chen," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the room, and 18 months ago, I was a victim of elder abuse who thought no one would ever believe me. Today, I'm here to tell you that if someone you love seems different, withdrawn, or afraid, trust your instincts. And if you're experiencing abuse yourself, know that you're not alone, you're not crazy, and it's never too late to ask for help. The audience included social workers, medical professionals, family members of elderly people, and several other survivors like myself. In the front row sat Tommy, now 9 years old and proudly wearing a name tag that read, Honorary Elder Abuse Prevention Advocate. His mother Karen had made the tag specially for him, recognizing that his innocent questions and refusal to accept adult explanations had been the key to my rescue. After my presentation, during the question and answer session, a woman in her 50s raised her hand. "My mother has been living with my sister-in-law for 2 years, and she's become so quiet and nervous. But my sister-in-law is wonderful, everyone says so. She takes Mom to all her appointments, manages her medications, speaks for her at family gatherings. How do you know when caregiving crosses the line into control?" Her question could have been describing my own situation 8 months earlier. "The first red flag," I said, "is when the caregiver becomes the only voice the elderly person has. Caring for someone means preserving their autonomy and dignity, not replacing their voice with your own. If your mother has stopped speaking for herself, if she seems afraid to contradict her caregiver, if she's lost touch with friends and activities she used to enjoy, those are warning signs worth investigating." After the presentation, I was approached by Detective Rivera from the county's Elder Abuse Task Force. "Mrs. Chen," she said, "we've had 3 cases in the past month where family members said your story gave them permission to trust their concerns about elderly relatives. 2 of those cases resulted in protective interventions. Your advocacy is making a real difference." The work wasn't easy. Some days, the weight of other people's stories, so similar to my own, threatened to pull me back into the darkness I'd escaped. That's when Dr. Sarah Martinez, my therapist, reminded me about the importance of boundaries and self-care, even in advocacy work. "Margaret," she said during one of our sessions, "you can't save everyone, and trying to will only drain you of the strength you need for your own healing. Your job isn't to rescue every abuse victim, it's to shine a light on the path out for those who are ready to take it. The healing process had been more complex than I'd expected. The physical injuries from Sarah's abuse had healed within months, but the psychological wounds ran deeper. Learning to trust my own perceptions again, to believe that I deserved care and respect, to stop automatically minimizing my own needs, these were ongoing challenges that required patience and professional help. My relationship with David continued to evolve as we both processed the trauma of what had happened in his home. He'd started his own therapy to deal with the guilt of having unknowingly enabled my abuse, and we'd begun having honest conversations about the warning signs he'd missed and the family dynamics that had made me vulnerable. "Mom," he said during one of our weekly dinners at my apartment, "I've been thinking about how Sarah was able to fool me so completely. I realize now that I wanted to believe her version of events because it was easier than facing the possibility that something terrible was happening in my own house." "David," I replied, recognizing that is the first step toward making sure it never happens again, not just in our family, but in any family where you might have influence. My living situation had stabilized beautifully. The one-bedroom apartment I'd chosen was in a senior community that offered independence with available support services. I'd reconnected with my bridge club. Eleanor cried when I told her the full story of why I'd disappeared from their games. My weekly schedule now included volunteering at the Elder Abuse Prevention Center, regular therapy appointments, and social activities I'd chosen for myself. Most significantly, I'd begun dating again. Harold had been gone for over 2 years, and I'd started to feel ready for companionship. Robert was a 74-year-old widower I'd met at the community center, and he approached our relationship with the same respect for my autonomy that I'd learned to demand from everyone in my life. Tonight, I was preparing for another milestone. Tommy's 4th grade class had invited me to speak about speaking up when something seems wrong. His teacher, Mrs. Johnson, had explained that Tommy had been telling his classmates about his brave questions that helped save his great-grandmother, and several students had asked to hear the story directly from me. Standing in front of my bedroom mirror, adjusting the same blue dress I'd worn to David's birthday party, the night that felt like a lifetime ago, I marveled at the woman looking back at me. She was older, certainly, with new lines around her eyes that spoke of surviving hard things. But she was also stronger, wiser, and more determined than the grieving widow who had moved in with David and Sarah 20 months earlier. Tomorrow, I would tell a classroom full of 9-year-olds that their voices mattered, that adults didn't always know best, and that sometimes the most important thing you could do was ask a simple question when something seemed wrong. I would tell them about Tommy's courage, and how one little boy's refusal to accept adult explanations had saved his great-grandmother's life. But tonight, I was simply Margaret Chen, survivor, advocate, and living proof that it's never too late to reclaim your voice, your truth, and your right to live without fear. The woman who had once hidden bruises under long sleeves was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that healing wasn't about forgetting the past, but about transforming it into wisdom that could light the way for others still trapped in darkness. Sarah had given the best toasts at parties and the worst bruises after. But in the end, my voice had proven stronger than her charm, my truth more powerful than her lies, and my survival more lasting than her cruelty.